The Florida State Seminoles looking to regain the top spot of the ACC after the Clemson Tigers beat them for the first time since those two teams have emerged as the class of the conference, and Florida State trying to fight this one back and get back to the top spot after 3 losses in 2015. We bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC to help us look at the Noles coming out of spring ball and headed toward August. Mike, it kind of starts with quarterback. This is not sealed down. Sean McGuire would be the incumbent of sorts, but at the same time, after a 59% completion percentage last year, 11 TDs, 3 picks, he certainly has a couple players on his heels that are more dynamic and maybe higher ceilings.
Yeah, definitely. And when has the position ever really been locked down with Sean McGuire, quarterback? Obviously, took over about 3/4 of the way through the season last year when Everett Golson was struggling there for Florida State. Kind of took the reins. He played okay. Like you mentioned, 59% of his passes, 11 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 139.7 passer rating. So he was decent, threw for 1,500 yards. But the thing with Sean McGuire is that he's never really taken games over. And I think that's the one thing that a lot of Florida State fans would like to see is Sean McGuire be able to make the next step. But what we saw this spring with Sean McGuire out nursing injury is that they have 2 really talented players behind him at quarterback. DeAndre Francois, he's going to be a redshirt freshman this year, really could potentially push Sean McGuire for the starting job this fall. Had a very impressive spring. Also Malik Henry, the true freshman, obviously one of the top quarterbacks in the country. Everybody was talking about how good of a quarterback he was coming out of high school, and he has potential to obviously make a splash here down the road for Seminoles as well. So 2 pretty young quarterbacks behind the senior McGuire. Here coming into fall camp. They both made very positive strides forward this spring. So you just never know what happens. You know, Sean McGuire struggles. I think DeAndre Francois, just because he's had the extra year in the system, would have a leg up on Malik Henry. But I think Francois will definitely have an opportunity to push McGuire. And if he doesn't win the starting job in camp, he could definitely take the starting job over if McGuire were to struggle here in the early part of the season.
You know, Mike, it's easy to brush by the running back position, check it off as Dalvin Cook, and everything's sealed and delivered and ready to go. But, of course, injuries happen. Dalvin Cook will need some rest at times, and Florida State quite a bit thinner there, unfortunately, than they were just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so Dalvin Cook, you know, when you have a bell cow running back like him running for 1,700 yards last year, and he was injured. I mean, he was not real healthy. He was struggling with hamstring issues and still scored 19 touchdowns and should have been more heavily considered in my mind for the Heisman Trophy, but he wasn't because of Florida State's record last year. They had a little bit of a down year, but he's definitely going to be in the Heisman discussion this year. Well, the running back behind him, Mario Pender, who usually is brought in to spell him at the position, is charged with a domestic violence incident. So he's been dismissed from the team, and he's not going to be in the fold, at least for the immediate future. Who knows if he actually will end up making a return or not. But Jacques Patrick, the sophomore, will definitely have his opportunity in the spotlight. He really came on late last year, played pretty well, 314 yards rushing and 5 total touchdowns on the season for him. But we really saw the growth out of him as a freshman last year towards the latter half of the season. Jimbo Fisher was real tough on him throughout most of his freshman campaign, saying that he wasn't really tough enough. But we saw some more tough running out of Jacques Patrick there late in the season last year, especially when Dalvin Cook was struggling a little bit more heavily with those hamstring issues. So I think the one thing that we're going to watch for here now with Mario Pender being ruled off the team here this spring because of the off-the-field issues is, you know, Jacques Patrick could be the guy to slide in and potentially help out Dalvin Cook in the backfield. But one other guy I wanted to talk about is Ryan Green. Green is a player that has kind of switched back and forth between positions, came in as a running back, played some receiver, and now he's back in the running back position. He's another guy who could potentially take some carries as well. When Dalvin Cook needs a little bit of a rest, but all indications are if Dalvin Cook's healthy, he's going to get a heavy majority of the carries, as he should.
Yeah, one of the few running back situations in the country where that's the guy. We don't usually see hardly anyone else during crunch time. So many other teams across the country on all levels of football have gone to a main guy, but then basically a running back by committee. But Dalvin Cook definitely workhorse by definition. You mentioned Patrick. He ran for 314 last year, 5 even per carry, 5 touchdowns. No Mario Pender again, not a huge issue if Cook stays healthy. He's got 71 career attempts at the running back position for Florida State. A guy I'd like to highlight, Mike, before we dive into the wide receiver role is Auden Tate. He gained quite a bit of attention following Florida State's spring game as a big body receiver, a guy that can high point the football and really be difficult for smaller defensive backs to deal with. So he's a name kind of off the radar that we may see make some crucial catches in some situations coming up in 2016. But besides that, the main three guys, Travis Rudolph, Bobo Wilson, Kermit Whitfield, all back for Florida State after a 16-touchdown, 174 reception total out of that trio last season.
Yeah, I mean, those three receivers coming back, obviously huge, but having a guy come in like Auden Tate, being the size that he is at 6'5", and making the plays that he made the spring game particularly, he had over 100 yards receiving. But he was also a guy that Jimbo Fisher praised throughout most of the spring, just saying how he really came on and played really well for Florida State. And he's a guy at 6'5", obviously a big body guy they can use in the red zone, and Florida State's really lacked that here over the last few seasons since Kelvin Benjamin moved on to the NFL. So having a guy like Auden Tate into the fold would be extremely beneficial for them. Additionally, they have another guy, Keith Gavin, a pretty highly touted recruit a couple of years ago. He's going to come in. I think he could potentially make a case for the fourth or fifth receiver as well. 6'3" body, big guy, can really run, great hands, just a very athletic playmaking receiver, just to add to the list of Florida State receivers that can go out and make some plays. But I think Florida State's going to have a pretty strong positional group there at wide receiver, at least one that their fans can be proud of.
Of course, we're used to Florida State dominating on defense, and I think it was this unit with the lack of a dynamic playmaking offense that kept Florida State near the top of the ACC, kept them in the Clemson game tied with about 7 or 8 minutes to play on the road, but wilted against Houston. That was kind of inexplicable and surprising to me. They did have to deal with some injuries, and that's what we're going to highlight to a certain extent. A number of guys that we didn't see on the field in 2015 could be prominent this season. So I'll let you kind of scan the defense and do what you will there in regards to your thoughts about Florida State coming up defensively. The one thing I will note is while the Seminoles might have the best offensive threat in college football in Dalvin Cook on offense, they might also have the best player on defense, arguably, in Derwin James.
Yeah, I mean, Florida State's defense, look, I mean, they're losing some pretty dynamic playmakers. Obviously, losing a guy like Reggie Northrup out of your linebacking core, and then losing Jalen Ramsey in the secondary, who was a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. Those guys are not easy to replace, but they are returning some key cogs to that defense last year that played pretty well for the majority of the season. Derek Nandi is the one guy at defensive line that really kind of stands out to me as a guy that Florida State absolutely needed to have back. And he has 45 tackles last year, 2 sacks, a guy that was definitely an interior force for them. And additionally, you know, when you look back, you know, across the defensive line, obviously Josh Sweat coming into his own as a sophomore, DeMarcus Walker, who's going to be a senior, made 13 starts last year. So those two on the defensive ends obviously will make a big difference in whether or not Florida State's going to compete for an ACC championship. Their ability to get pressure on the quarterback is definitely going to be paramount in that regard, especially with the losses that Florida State's endured in the secondary. Roderick Hoskins at linebacker, he made 4 starts last year. He kind of came on towards the end of the season. He's going to be a junior this year, and obviously he'll see more of an expanded role now that Terrence Smith and Reggie Northrup have both moved on to the NFL. And then the secondary, I mentioned the loss, of course, of Jalen Ramsey, but Marquez White, the defensive back that lined up opposite of Jalen Ramsey for all 13 games in 2015, he's back in the secondary. Derwin James, of course, a dynamic safety. And Trey Marshall at safety, he'll slide into a full-time role. He was playing more of the star position last year, which is kind of Florida State's nickelback in layman's terms. And Trey Marshall, he'll be a junior this year. And, of course, he made 6 starts last year before fracturing his arm, missing the rest of the season. So having him back in the secondary will definitely be huge. And Florida State's definitely going to have some playmakers back there, even though they're losing a guy like Jalen Ramsey in the back end of the secondary. But their ability to get pressure on the quarterback is, I think, really going to dictate whether or not they can overcome a Clemson down the road, because I think Florida State is really going to be able to get through a majority of their schedule. But when they get to that Clemson game, whether or not they'll be able to get enough pressure on Deshaun Watson will dictate whether or not Florida State will be able to get to an ACC championship game. So the defense is going to be paramount this year, along with the quarterback play that we've already talked about.
Good segue there, Mike, because when we talk about Derwin James, we talk about a potential disruptor, even more so than he's been in the past. He could really separate himself as one of the elite defenders. 91 tackles last year, 9.5 for loss, 4.5 sacks. Much use of him during the spring, actually coming up, playing a little defensive end of sorts, and being one of those guys that the offense needs to identify where is Derwin James and how do we block him, how do we deal with him. And so they've been playing around with some schemes to free him up to do just that, rush the passer, and Deshaun Watson being target number one, and of course a date against Miami and Brad Kaya. DeMarcus Walker, don't want to forget about him after 15.5 tackles for loss and 10.5 sacks. You mentioned Sweat. We know the recruiting battle all over the nation for this kid. He was not just considered one of the best at his position, but the overall top player. He was in that conversation. And yes, solid contributor last year with 41 tackles and 5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, but those numbers could skyrocket depending on how he's used. And Matthew Thomas had a big spring at linebacker. You mentioned the play of Roderick Hoskins after 52 tackles and 6 for loss last year. He should only get better. Then there's a couple guys in the linebacking core as well who didn't see much time last year due to injuries, but maybe relied on this year. Delvin Purifoy played with an ankle issue last year and missed some time. Terrell Lyons as well, a torn ACL, but they expect him back at full strength. You outlined the cornerback situation. Jalen Ramsey gone. Tavares McFadden's going to be battling a Marcus Lewis for the starting job. Obviously, both of those players are going to see significant play on the field with 4 and 5 wide receivers all over the place, but they're battling for the top cornerback position opposite Marquez White, who is the field corner. So it's Florida State coming off a 10-3 season, looking to unseat Clemson and get back to their usual spot atop the ACC. All right, Mike, appreciate the time.
All right, thanks, Mark.